have two wonderful lecturers tonight. So I'd like to thank you for your support for the San Juan County Democrats and encourage you to vote, obviously, in November. And above that, to also support the Democrats. Not only of this county, but statewide, there's some real close, tight races that we could win and flip the Senate, which would be really fabulous. So, we have a especially rich program, the Abandonment of the U.S. International Leadership, and our two outstanding presenters, Susan Martin and Nisha Quast. And we're so honored that they agreed to speak with us. Let's talk about Susan, and I'll just tell you a little bit about her. She is the Donald G. Herzberg Professor Emerita in International Migration at Georgetown University. During the Clinton administration, she was the executive director of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform. She's written 3 books and is working on the revision of the 4th? Yeah. 5. Well, you know, can't get everything right. It's A Nation of Immigrants is one of her books, Refugee Women and International Migration, Evolving Trends from the Early 20th Century to the Present. She and her husband, Michael, have a home here on San Juan Island since 2001 and moved here permanently in 2016. And Nisha Quast is a retired Foreign Service officer who worked 26 years in the Department of State. She is an economist and served 8 embassies on 4 continents, as well as in Washington, D.C. She retired in 2011 with her husband, Tim, moved to San Juan Island, and remains in touch with many colleagues still serving overseas and in Washington. Last summer, she did a 5-month stint for the UN in Bangladesh. So I would like you to give a warm welcome to Susan and Nisha.
Is the ceiling? Susan wandered off. Oh, Susan! That's the other one.
Push the button at the bottom. Push
Hello?
the bottom button.
Here it comes.
Oh, she took the
I was going to start singing.
Okay, I'll just mention a little bit about the format. We're going to do kind of a discussion. I'm going to ask Susan a question and a follow-up, and then she's going to ask me a question and a follow-up. I'll ask her a second question and follow-up, and vice versa. And then at the end, our moderator is going to ask us both the same final wrap-up question. We're going to try to do that in about an hour, and then open it up to the floor for questions. So kicking it off, I will start with my first question to Susan, which is, you're an expert on migration and refugee issues and are working on a 2nd edition of your book, A Nation of Immigrants, with updates from the Obama and the Trump years. What are your views and what is taking place in these areas right now?
Thank you, and thanks to David for inviting me to participate in this session. I could say it in one sentence: the policies today are dismal. They're about as bad as I've seen in my 40 years of experience working on immigration and refugee issues in the U.S. and internationally. I want to start by saying a couple of words about what I see as U.S. leadership and what I'm talking about, and the ways in which the U.S. exerts leadership. And we exert leadership, and I say we because I've had enough stints in the government, and I've been on the end of delegations to foreign governments to talk about mostly refugee and migration issues. So I have a fairly good idea of what they expect from the U.S. government. And I think we exert influence 2 ways. One is certainly by our diplomacy, and Missy knows a whole lot more about that than I do, and I'm sure we'll be touching on it in her remarks. But the other way we exert leadership is by our actions. The U.S. is a model for sometimes, many times, most times in the past for good. It's also over time has been a model for really bad policies. And there have been enough times that I've been in exchange with a foreign senior official and will say something about, why are you closing your borders to Somalis coming into Kenya, or Syrians coming into Lebanon or Jordan? And they immediately, I have this specific example on the case in Somalia. It was in the early 1990s, and the retort immediately was, why are you doing what you're doing to the Haitians? If it's good enough for the U.S., it's certainly good enough for us to close our borders. And so anything that we do by our actions tend to have both diplomatic consequences in terms of what we're trying to ask of other countries, but some real life and death consequences for the people who are affected by what happens, and not just in the U.S., but then by extension what happens around the world. And I want to mention 4 different areas where I see our policies as taking the wrong turn under this administration. The first, and I think in some ways the most serious, is with regard to our refugee and asylum policies. Our refugee policies usually refer to what we do overseas, whether it's in providing financial support to the UN agencies that protect refugees, or our refugee resettlement program, where we bring people from overseas who are either in danger or for whom there are no solutions. So our asylum policy, by contrast, is when people spontaneously come to the U.S. They may come in order to apply for asylum specifically and permission to remain in the country, or they may be in the U.S. and all hell breaks loose in their country of origin, and they just can't go home for one reason, for good reasons, because it would be too dangerous for them. So the U.S., since the end of World War II, and largely because of the terrible experiences of the 1930s, which I'll actually get into a little bit more later, but since the end of World War II, the U.S. has been a clear leader in pressing for protection of refugees, making sure they're not forcibly returned to their home countries, and protected where they're able to find safety wherever in the world that is. We do it through our donations. Initially, the Trump administration wanted to cut funding for overseas assistance for refugees. They have provided cut funding for the UN agency that works with Palestinian refugees, tried to do it globally. The Congress did stop that, and fortunately at this point that funding is still flowing. But we also did it through our resettlement program. In some years past, we've resettled as many as 220,000 refugees in a single year when there were multiple crises. But interestingly, where those multiple crises, for example, in 1980, produced fewer refugees than the current crises are producing. But we had very robust resettlement at that point. And on average, though, in the subsequent periods, it's been between 75 and 100,000 refugees resettled per year. That's a relatively small number, certainly compared to the millions of refugees worldwide who are in need of resettlement, but also in terms even of our, it's about 1/10 of the total legal immigration that we have coming into the country. So it's still a fairly small number. The administration cut the numbers for this year from what should have been 110,000 originally under the Obama plan to 45,000. But as of the statistics that I just looked up this week to see where we are, is that 11 months into the current fiscal year that ends in the end of September, we've not even resettled 20,000. And it's impossible to be much more than 20,000 by the end of this fiscal year. And there's talk coming out of the administration, trial balloons are being flown about lowering the ceiling to what the actual admissions are for this year, which would mean there'd be no potential for moving up that number, regardless of what kinds of pressures might be put on or what new crises there are. On the asylum front, we're seeing problems as well, mostly in terms of actions being taken administratively to make it harder for people seeking asylum, safety in this country, to be able to obtain it. I won't talk about what's happening to the children who are separated from their parents, or the zero tolerance policies where everyone is to be prosecuted, even those who are seeking asylum, and present themselves at our ports of entry requesting asylum. So they're not trying to sneak into the country. They're actually showing up, but they're in the prosecution stream also because they didn't have a visa prior to coming. Getting a visa is not easy for anyone. For a refugee, it's often impossible because they can't get the records that they need to convince the U.S. that they should receive a visa, or any other countries for that matter. But the other things that are happening is the Attorney General has made two decisions that have real import for our being a protection country with regard to refugees and asylum seekers. One is that he has changed the standard by which those applying for asylum who are fleeing gang violence or domestic violence can receive admission into the U.S. or permission to stay, remain in the U.S. I've worked on this issue since the early 1990s. There's been a continual pathway towards recognizing that non-state actors, gangs, husbands, fathers, sometimes mothers, spouses, are inflicting violence not for personal reasons, but because of power relationships, that it's a way of controlling groups, and that where it rises to the level of persecution, which is the standard, and the cases that have gotten asylum are ones where often the beatings have been so severe that women have miscarried their children as a result of the beatings, where the women have tried to find safety elsewhere in the country, dragged back and beaten even more by their spouses. And when they go to the police and ask for protection, the police just say, well, that's what husbands are supposed to do. That's what I do. Obviously not much protection. Well, anyway, Sessions has overturned that type of interpretation, saying that you may be a refugee if you're the victim of private persecution, if the government is unwilling and unable to protect you from that violence. That's one aspect. The other that is also the long-term quite troubling is that he's put a quota on the number of cases that must be adjudicated by each immigration judge each year, so that they have 700 cases that they have to go through. Asylum cases are the hardest cases you can come by, and even though it's a civil process, the result can be the death of the person who's turned down. Most judges don't want to move forward if the person is unrepresented by counsel, but there is no right of representation at government expense. You have to find a lawyer. They'll give continuances in order to try to find a pro bono attorney for somebody's coming in. But under this provision, they're under a lot of pressure to just hear the case and make a quick decision. And they're making decisions that are going to determine whether somebody lives or dies, and under pressure to get as many done as possible. And they'll never be punished for saying no. But if they're delaying because they think there may be a reason to say yes, then they could be in particular trouble. I spent some more time than I will on the other issues on the refugee votes, because our history is that in the 1930s, many of these same administrative actions were taken with regard to refugees from Nazi Germany. The St. Louis, a boat from Hamburg, tried to land in Cuba, were not, even though they had permission to offload the passengers. There's a change in government in Cuba. Cuba said no. They approached the U.S. and every other government in the Western Hemisphere, asked for permission for the passengers to leave the boat. They were denied it by the U.S. and once the U.S. said no, every other country followed suit. This role model. The ship was forced to return to Europe. Fortunately, for some of them, Britain, France, and the Netherlands agreed to take the passengers. Those in Britain stayed safe, more or less, during the war. Those in France and the Netherlands, of course, when the Nazis occupied them, were sent to concentration camps. And half of the St. Louis passengers died in the Holocaust. So we know that there are immediate and very, very severe repercussions. We fool around with our refugee and asylum policies. Second area, to be more quick on this, is on legal admissions of people for family reunification and for other purposes. There are real problems with our legal immigration system. There's a clear need for reform. But one of the problems is not that too many people are being admitted. It's that the system is so unwieldy that it sometimes takes decades before people can actually go through the full admissions process. And if you're the sibling of a U.S. citizen, you would have had to apply about 20 to 25 years ago in order to be eligible to come in this year. And so we have an extremely unwieldy system. There are very few ways in which someone without a bachelor's degree can enter. So when we say, well, they should have been in the queue for people who are here without legal status, working as construction workers or gardeners or whatever they're doing, the matter of fact is that there are no legal pathways for them to come. So we need reform, but the reforms being offered are in order to cut the numbers of immigrants coming in. And certainly proportionate to our size, the numbers are much, much lower. We admit about 1 million people per year today in our legal permanent residence program. But in 1908 to 1911, we were admitting 1 million people per year. And so the population base was much smaller then, it's much larger now. So I'll tell anybody who wants the other two, I'll tell you.
So you've been working on these issues for decades. How do the things that are happening now compare to what's happened in the past?
Okay, well you can tell from what I've just been saying, we've had some really bad periods in the past. It's not that we should look at rose-colored glasses saying the immigrants were great before, U.S. policies were great before. I can tell you, having read a lot of, I'm a historian, so I've read a lot of the historical record. The immigrants weren't any different or any better before, but because we're their children and grandchildren, we think that they came with more gumption, more commitment to the country, etc. This has been, Benjamin Franklin wrote about a letter in the 1750s about the terrible Germans who were coming to Pennsylvania and would not ever become English. Of course they didn't, they became Americans. But this has been a refrain. We've also always had restrictionist movements. The know-nothings in the pre-Civil War period, the restrictionist movement at the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries. Probably the era that most resembles the current one is when they won and passed legislation in the 1920s that made it very, very difficult for Southern and Eastern Europeans to come in. And largely it was based on eugenics. The president of MIT, of all places, was the leader of the restrictionist movement based on eugenics. And he argued that the Southern and Eastern Europeans had lower IQs. Of course, they were given IQ tests in English, which they hadn't yet learned. And they were all culturally bound, which they didn't know what some of the answers meant. The questions meant. But also that in measuring their foreheads, they were smaller, so therefore had less brain power than the Anglo-white Northern Europeans who had settled the country. So we've always had some of these problems. But since the Civil Rights era, since 1965, when we adopted our framework for legal immigration, got rid of the national origins clauses that had been in place in the 20s, the U.S. and each administration has generally been positive with regard to immigration. In the 50s, more skeptical than was true from the period from 65 onward. This is the first administration and first president that we've had since that period who is definitely not concerned with the rights of immigrants and refugees. Quite the contrary. Wants to stem irregular migration, which many of us do, including myself. I'm actually something of a hardliner, but I want effective policies to do so that are based on due process. And who wants to restrict legal immigration, and who's doing all of this and proposing all of these policies in the absence of any evidence whatsoever. And it's really in some ways back to the Americans. They took pride in that label being put on them in their anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-Mexican rampages. And we're unfortunately, a segment of our population is getting back to that same sense of what we should do, but very little evidence with regard to what is in the national interest of the United States. Okay, I'm asking you questions. My turn. Okay. I'm gonna. I read some notes, but Nessie, you worked in the State Department for many years, as we heard in the introduction. What's your view of what's happening today in terms of the U.S. role on the international stage in all of its manifestations?
Well, I think the U.S. role on the national stage has been taking a serious blow in the last year and a half, and that's not from outside events, that's sort of self-inflicted damage led by the president and what's been going on. And I see those sort of attacks on U.S. global leadership happening in two broad areas. One is on institutions and one is on policy. The institutional attacks, overall, very broadly, I would characterize as an attack on professionalism, on the idea that the main work should be carried out by nonpartisan career experts in strong institutions with standard and transparent processes. Professional government staff has been attacked as a whole, both with sort of the broad deep state rhetoric that casts sort of all government employees as being part of some kind of conspiracy, and individually, many individual professionals have been attacked by name by the president, sort of an unprecedented thing to happen. We've seen people fired, we've seen people sidelined, we've seen security clearances pulled from people for political reasons. In addition to the attack on professionalism, there's attack on the specific institutions that carry out foreign policy. Trump and his appointees have worked to weaken institutions. Tillerson, as Secretary of State, proposed cutting the State Department by 1/3. Congress did not agree to that. Again, there have been many attacks on our intelligence and counterintelligence agencies. And these attacks have become the norm. Even the Department of Defense, which might seem a bit immune, and despite the huge increase in its budget, has seen a lot of sort of unusual meddling with its internal operations, attacks on personnel, and actions that weaken key elements of our defense profile, like our overseas bases, our alliances, and our information gathering. And finally, on the institutional side, I would say there's an attack on process. The administration has almost completely ignored or distorted the normal processes for policy and decision-making, and frankly, they don't appear to have their own process in place as a substitute. It's been reported that Trump routinely ignores or reverses Security Council decisions that have been made even in his presence and with his agreement at the time of the meeting. Agencies often find out about new policies from Twitter with no advance consultation or information about what the president's going to say. Two-way communication between the agencies and the White House appears to be very limited. An example, Trump disclosed highly classified intelligence from a U.S. ally to the Russian ambassador entirely on his own. Normally, before any intelligence is shared, there's an entire interagency process where every intelligence agency has to vet the decision and agree to that. And if it involves something that's come from an ally, that ally would have to also approve it. If literally anybody else up to, including the vice president, had done that, they would be facing a long federal prison sentence for that action. But, there was no process. The president just decided to do it and did it. And then the other side are, and where that affects the U.S. leadership, is that the institutions that we have out there working in the field and in Washington day to day, managing all of the many things that are going on, are undermined and weakened. They're understaffed, they lack credibility, they don't have the people in place. So it's just much harder to do the normal work, and a lot of things aren't happening at all. Susan mentioned that we were supposed to be admitting 45,000 refugees, and we've admitted less than half of that. So the normal work just isn't taking place. The other side are sort of attacks on policy. And I would put that, first of all, in attacks on our values, historically, especially since the end of World War II. The U.S. has promoted abroad and at home as part of our foreign policy. It's promoted democracy, it's promoted free trade, has promoted free movement, has promoted freedom of the press, has promoted human rights. Virtually all of these things are sort of under attack, not just abroad, but at home. And there's no way you can go to a government and say, quit throwing your journalists in jail when our president is attacking the press. You can't, go out and tell countries that they need to be more democratic when we're suppressing voter rights, have interference in our election systems, that we're refusing to strengthen the security of gerrymandering, all of these other things. The second place, and this is pretty shocking in some ways, are the attacks on our allies. The president has attacked NATO, not just criticized NATO, but has called into question its existence and its value. With North Korea and Japan, or with South Korea and Japan vis-a-vis North Korea, again, he's undermined those alliances. And not only has he attacked our allies, he's sort of cozying up to the people that are the adversaries of our allies. Cozying up to the enemies of your friends is usually not a good policy. And then finally, there's been an attack sort of on global institutions and processes in architecture. So, we've been withdrawing from international agreements, we've been withdrawing from international agencies, we've cut funding to parts of the UN. And it basically appears that we don't want to be part of the global community if that in any way restricts our sovereignty, which is frankly the whole point. and frankly, the American first rhetoric is tantamount to saying that we're not interested in being a global leader. If you're a leader, that means you're taking the interests of the community as a whole and equating them with your interests and willing to put them on an equal level and possibly on occasion even first. And the rhetoric now is our interests are first, your interests don't really matter, and you can't be a leader when that's your position. So it's obvious that other people stop looking to you for leadership when you show that you're not willing to be part of the global community, you're not willing to honor international agreements, you're not willing to consult and work with others, you're no longer a leader.
Let me follow up on that last point in terms of the international organizations. There appears to be a backlash, not just in the US, but worldwide against globalization. And certainly these international organizations are an aspect of that. And I certainly feel it a lot in the immigration refugee area, but it goes well beyond that. So why should we as Democrats be concerned about the administration's actual and threatened actions related to trade agreements, like NAFTA or role of the WTO?
Right, so the trade agreements, again, are something we've been, Trump has said that we need to renegotiate. NAFTA has threatened to pull out. He's imposed tariffs against many countries at this point in violation of our WTO agreement. And the reason that's a problem, among other things, is, there's a saying that countries that trade with each other don't go to war against each other. And in the trade relationship that's been built up since World War II, that has generally proven to be true. War between countries has fallen dramatically to a very small amount. Today, almost all conflict is sort of internal civil conflict rather than war between countries. And peace is kind of the foundation of prosperity, but it's not just that. Trade in and of itself and the tremendous amount of growth in trade is directly linked to the steep downward trend in global poverty that's been ongoing, which has really been quite dramatic if you look at the numbers. It's also one of the reasons why the developing countries are able, the developed countries are able to maintain economic growth, is the regular increase in trade. The other reason why it's very important, and it's worrisome to see it attacked, is, we have this concept of international law, which is very difficult to enforce. There are a lot of international agreements, and mostly it's the honor system. There's no enforcement mechanism. But the global trading structure and the global trading agreements are probably the strongest, most functional, real system of international law that we have. Almost every country in the world is part of that architecture. It governs millions of transactions every day. It's a real, practical, ongoing thing. There is enforcement because if a country violates the rules, as the US is currently doing, the other countries are allowed to retaliate. And there's a way to do that. So those global trade rules are sort of the best example we have of real functioning international law. And so if we attack that and we undermine it, we're also sort of attacking the entire idea of global cooperation and international order where all countries work together and live by the same set of rules. And I think that's a dangerous thing to try to undermine.
So round two.
Round two. Okay. So So Susan, you also wrote a book on the evolving global system of migration and the more long-standing system on refugees. What has been the U.S. role in global migration and refugee governance, and what is it now?
It's actually, this is perfect. I didn't realize where you were going to end up on your comments, but this is a perfect follow-up to what you were just saying about the role of law and international law and the way in which we think about it. In the immigration area, less so in the refugee area, the U.S. has forever made unilateral policies. And those unilateral policies govern whom we admit, whom we consider to be in irregular or illegal status in a country, what rights they have, and all of those types of issues that are part of the overall immigration policy. In the refugee area, after World War II, because of some of what I talked about occurring in the 1930s, there was a realization that unilateral policies didn't make sense for addressing refugees, largely because refugees are the failure of national sovereignty. They're the people who don't have a government that will take care of them. And so therefore you have to find some other way of protecting them, and it's as much for the security of the state as it is for the protection of the refugee that you need international cooperation. U.S. didn't initially buy it fully in the late 40s, early 50s. We still tended to go it alone until the Hungarian Revolution, when it became clear that as an instrument of foreign policy, it was useful for there to be an international system that would take care of the refugees produced by communism and communist regimes. And that's when the U.S. started to get on board with being part of a global system. We became the largest donor to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN agency, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, and a variety of other organizations. And we really pressed the need, after we finally ratified it in 1969, that government should be ratifying the UN Convention on Refugees to make sure that there is agreement, standards, and that the rights of refugees and of the states would be protected. On the immigration side, there was no such logic. Until the early 1990s, when a number of authors, myself included, began to make the case that immigration had become too complex to be managed solely through unilateral policies. That on a unilateral basis, it meant you might make a decision, but the country of origin of the would-be migrants might be going down a totally different path. And the transit countries through which they pass may have other rules. And that you needed to start getting cooperation amongst all three levels. And an ability to counteract the growing illicit trade in people, human trafficking and human smuggling. And you needed cooperation in order to be able to do that. Initially, the U.S. said, yeah, we will do this bilaterally. We'll make agreements with Mexico, Canada, whoever we need to. And then said, no, maybe regionally we'll do some stuff regionally, and supported the development of regional mechanisms. But we were very opposed through the 90s and through the Bush administration, second Bush administration, to becoming involved in any of the global discussions on full multilateral cooperation. But that process still unfolded. And there's a global forum on migration and development which came into being, which was a very effective way of getting governments to, for the first time, talk with each other about what do we want from immigration of your source country from immigration if you're a destination country? And can we get a win-win-win situation for the source country, the destination country, and the migrants themselves? When the Obama administration took office, we, of course, had a much more friendly ear to this process. The new administration was interested in seeing what could be done multilaterally and became a driving force continuing on the refugee side. And one of the last acts of President Obama was to host a global summit, leader summit on refugees to get agreements on what can be done to help Syrian refugees and others. And on the migration side, the non-forced movements, labor migration, family movements, we supported the development of what's now called the New York Declaration on Movements of Refugees and Immigrants. And that agreement was a very strong set of principles that all of the governments within the United Nations agreed to. It was a real success in that in about 20 years we could get to there. And a plan of action for taking concrete steps to put these principles into practice through negotiation of a global compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration. Then the administration changed. And one of the early steps on migration that the administration took was to remove the U.S. from the negotiations of the Global Compact. Now, the Global Compact it's like the Paris Accord. It's not binding. It's voluntary commitments. So no one was asking the U.S. to do anything that it didn't want to do. It was asking for it to make some commitments in terms of protecting the rights of migrants, most of which up until now we've been doing fairly well. Having processes for irregular migration, for controlling irregular migration, etc. The upshot is that the rest of the world went beyond us. They negotiated this agreement. It will be adopted formally in December. There are only 3 states that so far have said that they won't sign. The United States, Hungary, which if you follow the newspapers, the president of Hungary is very xenophobic and nationalistic, and Australia over the issue of detention, as is one of our issues as well. And so the U.S. is really losing leadership because we could have made this into an even stronger document, and I think we would have in a previous administration. But it's very unfortunate.
So how does that affect U.S. standing on the international stage in our relationships?
Well, I can tell you that the countries that have been busily working at trying to come to consensus and to negotiate this agreement are not particularly happy with the United States. And that means that all of the countries that are other destinations for immigrants aren't happy. All of the countries that are source countries or transit countries aren't happy. It reduces tremendously our ability to go to these countries and ask things of them, help in controlling smuggling operations that are operating on their territory. We won't help them. Why should they help us? So I think it's a self-defeating policy decision to decide to withdraw from processes of this sort because it isolates us. And I'm not sure that we want to be in a club of 3 on these issues when another 190 governments are moving in an opposite direction.
Okay, so next.
Oh, you're fun. Sorry.
If you don't have it, I do.
Okay, now you do.
No, you've got the final question. She's got the second.
Oh,
We're still on the second minute. Sorry about that.
sorry.
So, Nancy, you still have lots of friends in the State Department. You hear about what's going on there. So what's happening in terms of diplomatic institutions? You started touching on it a bit in your first round, but can you expand on that?
Yes, so it's pretty grim times at the State Department. I mentioned that when Tillerson came in, he immediately proposed cutting the State Department by a third. That did not happen, but nonetheless, it's been a very hostile environment. And among the most senior level diplomats, more than a third were either fired, retired, or resigned within the first year. Many positions have, Tillerson also forbade lateral transfers within the State Department. So as people moved out to go overseas, people couldn't be moved in to fill jobs. So a large number of jobs, especially the senior jobs, weren't filled. Appointments have run exceptionally slowly. Again, so senior jobs were either empty entirely or filled with an acting person who didn't have sort of the full weight of being able to do the job. They're just sort of keeping the seat warm. That goes to ambassadorships. They have been extremely slow to fill. You probably remember that Trump ordered that all ambassadors leave immediately, and political ambassadors weren't allowed to stay a few weeks or months before their predecessor got there. And so friends of mine who were deputy chiefs of mission, which is the second in command, and when the ambassador leaves, then they're in charge, and they're called the chargé. So friends of mine in large important countries like Germany and India were the chargés for more than a year. Ambassadors weren't appointed to those countries. So that, leaves a gap of leadership and a lot of people wondering what's going on. There have also been all kinds of things where senior people have been punished by being reassigned to do low-level work. Under Tillerson, the favorite thing was to assign them to process Freedom of Information Act requests. That was a way to force people to quit, and I understand that's one of the things Pompeo stopped when he came into the office. Tillerson also immediately fired all diplomatic spouses who were working overseas. We have programs where jobs that need to be filled by an American can be filled by a spouse if they're qualified, to avoid having to send a whole other entire household overseas, and also because spouses who have jobs are happier spouses. He fired all those people, so that made a lot of people unhappy and also left a lot more jobs unfilled. Even now, I saw there's a big protest, and Congress has asked they cut back health and education funding for family members with special needs and mental health issues. So sort of an attack on the conditions of service has been going on. Reportedly, one of Trump's appointees in the International Bureau has taken it upon herself to monitor all State Department employees' personal social media accounts, and also any U.S. citizens working for UN agencies, to keep lists of who is and is not loyal to Trump. You also seen very recently the previous CIA director Brennan's security clearance was pulled. Trump has threatened to pull other people's clearances. In an unprecedented act, 13 former directors and deputy directors of the CIA signed a letter of protest about that and the harm that it does to politicize something like security clearances. And a former general, the one that was in charge of the operation, that went after Osama bin Laden, wrote an op-ed letter basically saying, take away my security clearance because I want to be on the list of people who opposed you. And for these people of that level to make that kind of public protest has never, ever happened. That is extremely unusual. I mean, not just extremely unusual, it's unique. So that sort of tells you the level of concern among people about what's happening to their institutions under this administration.
Okay, more substantively, what are the foreign policy issues that worry you the most?
Hard to pick one, but I'm going to mention two. First of all, I'll go with, kind of the elephant in the room. which is the Russia question. You ask yourself, Donald Trump is definitely taking actions to sort of wreck the global order and network of alliances that the U.S. has been working decades to create. The question is that deliberate, or is it just an accident of sort of ignorance and incompetence? In some ways, as an example of the things he's done, the Senate, you probably saw, actually Congress just passed the defense authorization bill, and the president signed it, but did what's called a signing statement, which is fairly usual. What is unusual is the kinds of things and the level of objections that he put, things that he would not implement or execute or didn't agree with. One of the things that was in there was that the U.S. supports the EU and NATO and would continue to support them. And his signing agreement was that he did not agree with that. So that's pretty astonishing to have a U.S. president, not just grumble about it, but to say in writing that he did not agree that the United States will support, the EU and NATO, which we're, with NATO at least, we're treaty bound to do so. In one way, the question of whether it's deliberate or whether it's just ignorance and incompetence doesn't matter, because either way, the consequences and the results are very bad for U.S. interests. And either way, it's very disturbing that these kinds of things are happening and we don't. Also, it's very, very difficult to believe that a U.S. president would be taking actions at the behest of a country who has made no secret that it's interested in weakening our global influence. On the other hand, if you look at actions that, are kind of ripped from a Kremlin dream book, it's hard to imagine that it's just a coincidence. So that's one of the things that's really worrying. What exactly is going on? Because these are not policies that are supported by his party or by his foreign policy advisors. And Congress has not stood up to Trump very much, but they have passed resolutions, non-binding resolutions, but there was a Senate resolution 98-2 objecting to the imposition of tariffs and a violation of the WTO agreement. We've mentioned budget cuts that he proposed that they did not agree to. They put forward a very strong sanctions policy against Russia over his objections, which he has not implemented. There have been some other resolutions and things like the language that was in the defense authorization bill, have been put there to express Congress's unhappiness with his policies. So these aren't some sort of partisan Republican policies necessarily. Maybe climate change, maybe Iran, but most of the others are frolics of his own. And it's not clear why and where that's coming from. The second issue that I'd like to mention is the militarization of foreign policy. This isn't something new. This is something that's been going on since the 90s. As sort of budgets and personnel cutbacks, first they happened after the collapse of Russia. There was kind of the idea of a peace dividend. We don't need all of this international infrastructure, which sort of ignored the fact that globalization meant more international stuff was going on all the time, even more so at the end of the Cold War. And as some of the civilian agencies had budget cuts or personnel cuts, or simply were keeping up with the growth, the military started to step in and take on roles and responsibilities that had been run by the civilian agencies because they weren't doing it and it needed to be done. And the military has the money and it has the people. And in 2006, the Senate issued a report on the militarization of foreign policy, said it's a bad thing, we should reverse this, we should do something about it. And every year now they hold hearings on it, and every year now they decry the militarization of foreign policy. It's been most visible in Africa. The Africa Command was created in Stuttgart basically just to oversee. It's not like we have military bases in Africa, but we have so many military personnel on the African continent carrying out basically foreign policy stuff, doing public information stuff, doing assistance, digging wells, working on HIV/AIDS, doing all these things that normally AID and the State Department and other agencies, the military is doing it because the other agencies don't have the staff with the money. And what really worries me is that with this, and in the Obama years this continued, again, not as a matter of policy, but in the last 6 years there was the sequester, and again, didn't affect defense so much, but the civilian agencies had their budgets frozen or cut. So again, as they were going back, the military continued to step forward and fill in those gaps. So it just kept growing. And now that those agencies are being very specifically undermined and attacked, it's my fear that, you know, once again, the military will fill in the gaps and will basically become the de facto foreign policy entity. That the other institutions will be so weakened, and that will have happened to such a great extent that the military, in fact, is in charge of foreign policy. And, you know, the problem with that, you know, you hear the thing, every hammer, all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The military is in charge of foreign policy. Every foreign policy solution starts to be, what can the military do? It's a military solution.
Well, on that cheerful note, I'm going to ask both of you to take, I don't know, take 5 minutes or so. When the wheel turns, what will be needed to rebuild policies, institutions, and relationships in your respective areas of expertise?
Shall I start?
Sure.
First of all, I haven't lost hope that the world can change, that we can reverse some of the worst of what's been happening, and ensure that some of the even worse things that haven't yet happened aren't adopted into policy. You know, familiar refrain, but certainly the elections, midterm elections are extremely important in this. That right now there isn't a real check and balance in Congress. We need at least one House, it looks now like more likely the House, to change so that there can be some real checks and balances on the and questions raised and some of the worst of the legislation forestalled. I think it's even more important, though, for the Senate to become democratic, because right now the main thing stopping the worst of the policies are the courts. And if the court becomes fully Republican and nominated by President Trump, then I think it would be really very, very, very likely that we see major changes and reversals time ahead. So I think the main thing, though, is for civil society and all of us to step forward. I think there are things that can be done in terms of domestic policy, support agencies that are representing immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers in their adjudications. Keep putting pressure on the areas I was going to talk about were the separated children, the detention, deportation system. There's still 500 kids who are unaccounted for. The majority of them, their parents were deported and still have not found them. And again, whether it was by design or sheer incompetence, the information about the parents and linkages to the children is just not kept. And the administration has really basically put the onus on the ACLU and other nonprofits to do the reunifications. They need help. They need to push back against the government, but if it's at the expense of the children, that's, nobody wins in that situation. On the international side, One thing that's happened during the Bush administration was that other governments looked at a small number of American academics, think tank people, practitioners in the field, to in a way be a shadow government delegation to some of the international meetings. So I was often invited to be the U.S. representative. I always had to start by saying, I'm not a U.S., I'm not at present a U.S. government official. I've worked for the U.S. government. I know, what the U.S. government thinks about these issues, and I can, give you some sense of where, what I hope will eventually become the U.S. government position on these. So it's important to be able to provide that kind of a framework to our allies. Washington State is doing it along with California and quite a number of other states on the climate change side. They are the representatives now to the discussions about implementation of the Paris Accords on mitigating climate change. They're following the U.S. commitments, even if the administration is trying to undermine them. We can do the same thing in other respects, whether it's government or civil society, can be stepping forward and providing the leadership that the government has forfeited at this point.
And from my side, I would say, I think policy is going to be the easy part, because traditionally, U.S. foreign policy has been very bipartisan. About 80 to 90% of what has been U.S. policy has been supported by both parties. And I see that still, underneath all the other craziness, that for the most part is still in place. So I'm pretty optimistic that we can rebuild a policy consensus towards our more traditional policies, and again, maybe looking at them again and retweaking it. Rebuilding institutions will be a little trickier, but certainly not impossible. The people are still there. I mean, they're out now, but they're still out there. They're still knowledgeable. They still have experience and expertise, and many of them are still going to be working on these issues and familiar with them. And if you go to rebuild institutions, you're going to find good people to staff it. The bigger issue is whether we are recommitted to professionalizing sort of government. That's something, it's being attacked now, but it's kind of eroded. And having, again, a better sense of what is the role of government and experts in government, and what is the relationship between career employees and political employees, building that back into a relationship of respect. The trickiest part has been having a party who's often have the notion that government is inherently bad, and that means it's pointless to try to make government work better if you think it's inherently bad. And if you do make it work better, you just undercut your argument, and so you don't want to do that. So getting past that, avoiding the make government more like a business. It's not a business, and so you should make it try to do what it is well, not try to make it into something it's not. The hardest part, or not the hardest part, the hardest part is going to be rebuilding relationships. I think we're really, we took a blow during the George W. Bush years, but, we're sort of recovering, but this is going to be really hard. I think we've really undermined any sense that you can rely on the U.S., that you can trust us, that we have institutions in place. Foreign policy is kind of unique in that the president has a lot of power. There are relatively limited ways that Congress and the courts can rein in the president, especially on the policy side. He gets to set policy, he gets to do it, there's not a lot to stop him. And it's become very apparent when we do have a Congress that isn't behind things, that if we have that the president can do what he wants and we don't have the systems to stop that. And so that's going to make people think twice. So rebuilding those relationships and trust is In the future, it's going to be situational. We're going to have to be a lot more consultative and cooperative in order to get others to work with us. This may not be entirely a bad thing. You know, we've been the 600-pound gorilla in the room, and it wouldn't hurt for us to have a slightly lower weight in the system and for other countries to step up. Again, the caveat that I see with that sort of hopeful thing is that the one place where we are overwhelmingly dominant is the size of the military. And I very much fear whoever is in leadership, if things aren't going the U.S. way, it's always going to be a temptation to look at the place where we're stronger and to use that.
Okay, we are now opening this up for questions, and please feel free. What I will say though is make sure it's a question and it's succinct. Okay, thank you. And anybody? Yes.
So putting aside refugees and asylum seekers, so I think you called the rest of them non-forced immigration. So just talking about that and talking, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
And talking to the person in Middle America who's trying to understand this. What is the case for having?
I think there's a very strong case, and it's because of a variety of reasons. One is that the majority of those who come in through our legal evasion systems are the families of U.S. citizens and U.S. permanent residents. And I think most Americans understand the importance of family reunification. And I think I could ask almost anyone here in this room that if your child or your grandchild meets and marries somebody from another country, should we allow them to live here legally? The majority of people will say yes, that that's a good thing. So one is that there's that type of humanitarian reason that applied not to the forced migrants, but to the others. Number two is that we have a demand for workers that either have very high levels of skills that would take a long time to train. American workers, it shouldn't be an either-or situation, but in the meantime, there are specific needs that have to be met. And that many of those high-skilled workers, for each one who comes into the country, multiple other jobs are produced that hire Americans. So it's not a zero-sum game. We're talking, not just at the high-skilled level, but also there are a lot of companies that have a range of jobs at various different skill levels. They hire a lot of Americans with bachelor's degrees or master's degrees, or people with some type of skills. But there are other jobs that require very low level of skills, and there aren't enough U.S.-born individuals with the low levels of education and that would make those jobs attractive, nor do they pay enough. Perhaps at a higher wage, they become more attractive, and we should do everything to attract U.S. workers into those jobs. Finally, our demographics are calling for it. Look around this room. We're an aging society. All of us are leaving or have left the labor force. There aren't as many kids behind us. We've got the bulge of the millennials who are even larger than the baby boomers in terms of absolute numbers. But the demographics are against us. There won't be enough young people paying taxes to support our retirement. And immigration is not the answer to that, but it's a part of the solution to making sure that we have a robust labor market and a robust set of people at all different skill levels who can meet those. Particularly in the demand for things like home health care workers, orderlies in hospitals, people who are doing tough hard labor. We're not doing those jobs. We need workers to do the jobs for us, and immigration is one way to get there. So I think there are a lot of good reasons that we need, but we need rational well-managed policies that are based on evidence and not on fears or suppositions. And right now, we don't have that in place. We need reform desperately, but not the type of reforms that are being proposed.
Another question? Tom?
Kind of a two-part question. I've heard a lot about what the creatures running the country are doing, but I'm not exactly sure why they're doing it. Maybe you could fill us in on that. And also, I would like to know what role the major corporations are playing in all this, please.
Okay, that's the question.
Do you want us to start at
Sure. Well, on the foreign policy side, that really is the question, is why. As I said, I don't think there's, there are definitely hawks who weren't thrilled about the Iran agreement. There are people on the environmental side who want to see the U.S. out of the climate accord. But aside from those two things, I don't think there is a reason that is supported by a significant number of Americans why we're implementing these policies. And so that raises the question of why. So I mentioned one of the things that we keep saying is, what's Russia's involvement since the Trump administration clearly, during the campaign had a lot of contact with Russia. Russia has admitted that they were intervening, if not with our election systems, but they were sort of promoting his candidacy. And so, you have to ask if there's more to it. And we don't know. Otherwise, and some of it is just, across the board. The president really doesn't have a very good understanding of international global issues and how these things work. His ideas that he expressed are often don't make much sense. So you could say he just doesn't know what he's doing, but he doesn't want to admit he doesn't know what he's doing. So every time he makes a mistake, he doubles down on it. So that's another possibility. Why? I don't know.
Just a quick thing, on the immigration side, I think that Trump found it a very useful device for gaining the Republican nomination. It won him primary votes, which the core, there was a segment that showed up in those primaries, bought the wall. Why? Beats me in terms of, if you're thinking of it in terms of logic, why you build a wall when we've got the lowest level of undocumented irregular migration across the southern border than we've had since the 1970s. But it worked. I think that in the general election, it wasn't a big enough downside for the Republicans who didn't necessarily agree with him, and independents didn't necessarily agree with him in the way in which he was presented. It didn't make them not vote for him that he had those positions. I think since he's become president, he, number one, feels an obligation to win again, his own view, and that those primaries are still going to be there, so he wants to make sure that he's appeasing that part of the electorate. And I think he's ceded a lot of the policy making on these issues to Jeff Sessions and to Stephen Miller. Miller is the Domestic Policy Council director, who had a playbook from the Federation for American Immigration Reform, the Center for Immigration Studies, to restrictionist organizations. And they had about 70 changes that were needed, and he has been checking them off one by one. It's moving much more through administrative processes, because he knows that if it gets to the court or to the Congress, it doesn't go through. But he's operating so quietly on so many different fronts, and getting Miller's acolytes into those positions that are going to have to implement the policies. And so it's become almost unstoppable except for the courts. And that's where the reins are now being drawn. withdrawn on it.
David?
Yeah, we have a very strong attorney general in our state who is fighting a lot of the actions that Trump has taken. And we have hope that other states, and probably California is doing the same thing, I don't know about Oregon, but we have hope that there's a trend towards states taking control and saying we can combat his policies. And the blue states, obviously, the red states probably not. What about the purple states? I mean, is there a trend in that direction?
Well, it's actually, having lauded the courts on this, I'm also very nervous about it because a lot of the court action during the Obama administration was by red states trying to stop things like deferred action for childhood arrivals and the program for their parents and others. So Arizona, Texas, the Republican-held states were suing the federal government to stop the Obama executive actions. Now Washington, California, New York, et cetera, are suing to stop the Trump issues. This is not healthy because when you've got a government that has to bounce back and forth, civil servants are never sure just what the policies are going to be tomorrow. The ones I know who are working in the Department of Homeland Security, are trying their best to keep things from exploding, but they're also really worried about losing their jobs, and they're worried about being sued. And when that's the environment in which policy is taking place, it's not good for anybody. So for me, the answer is to change Congress in order to be able to get to policies that are hardball and aren't dependent on which states decide to sue and which states sit back.
And I would just mention that, again, it will be a double-edged sword because states are doing some of their own things, and then the federal government, in the reverse, the federal government is suing the states, trying to bring them in line with federal policy. So again, this will go to the courts. The courts will be deciding these difficult questions on what's the balance of power between the federal government and the states. And, it depends on who's in charge of the federal government and who's in charge of the states, as Susan just mentioned. And as these cases go to trial and decisions are made, that sets precedences. And as the courts change, we could be living with some very ugly precedents for a long time that are brought forward by these actions of the states.
We'll take one more question. Okay, Sandra.
Do you have any sense or knowledge that the European Union is organizing a response to the amazing and unusual attitude of the United States from NATO to refugee crisis?
It's my sense that they're sort of rapidly realizing that they can't count on the United States to the extent that they were able to in the past, and that they have to sort of step up their game and take more responsibility on themselves. I mean, it really, there's so many things that have never happened before that are unprecedented, but, on its last trip to Europe, and also in the case of Germany, the UK and Germany are two of our strongest and most important allies. And in Germany, the ambassador, and in the UK, Trump himself basically, expressed the desire that more right-wing parties be in power. The conservative government parties are in power in both of those countries. So normally a U.S. president, not just a U.S. president, no head of state or head of government would publicly comment on the internal political state of another country and who they want to see or not see in power. People know, that Reagan liked Thatcher and Thatcher liked Reagan, and so it goes without saying, you don't have to say it. Nobody says it. It's a no-no. But for sort of a Republican to attack two conservative leaders sort of in favor of far-right parties is really kind of astonishing. And I think the Europeans understand very clearly that it's a different ballgame, and that they have to respond differently, and they have to start thinking differently about how they go forward.
Yeah, on migration and refugee issues, unfortunately, the EU has its own problems. It's threatening, it's immigration is the issue that is threatening the survival of the European Union, and particularly the crisis in 2014 with the mass movements of asylum seekers into Europe. The new EU states in Eastern Europe generally refuse to go along with the decisions of Germany, France, etc., that there should be burden sharing and responsibility sharing, and that it shouldn't just be Germany and Sweden that would bear the brunt of receiving the refugees, and Greece and Italy would bear the brunt of being the first country in which they touched the soil. And the Eastern Europeans said no, we will not cooperate, and it produced a crisis. Brexit, of course, is a very clear manifestation of this problem. Immigration was the key issue in the Brexit vote in terms of leaving the European Union in order not to receive other European Union member state nationals. And so I don't give much hope for a great turnout. I mean, they're doing a good job in keeping the multilateral discussions going on that, but their actions are problematic, to say the least, in terms of providing a model for how effectively you can cooperate to manage migration.
I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want you to continue your support for the San Juan County Democrats, but I also want you to praise these women.